Philip II by William Thomas Walsh. Chapter 6. Philip and Maximilian, 1547 to 1549. September was half spent when Maximilian, with a great burst of music and colour, at last appeared at Valladolid. Philip received him with the elaborate courtesy prescribed by the new Flemish etiquette, and with every outward sign of the affection due to a cousin and a brother-in-law. What he had heard from Germany of the aspirations of Maximilian and Uncle Ferdinand must have put a fine edge on the curiosity with which he inspected his old playfellow, who had become his rival for the iron crown of the Lombards and the mantle of Charlemagne. Behind the polite phrases and courteous smiles of the two young men, there was a new reserve and distrust. In some respects, the German prince had changed little since the old days, when they had played in this very palace together, and had studied with Dr. Salizio at Alcalá. He was taller, of course, and had a moustache and a faint suggestion of beard, but he was still the slender, ineffectual, and debonair Max of former days. He had eyes somewhat like Philip's, and an even more pronounced suggestion of the Habsburgs in the jaw and under lip. Moro's portrait of him in the Museo del Prado indicates a considerable resemblance between the two young men, but Maximilian lacked his cousin's dignity and poise. Philip's feet rested firmly on the ground, parallel and deliberate. Maximilian's turned out, with a suggestion of something careless and inconsequential. He was jovial and talkative, charmingly indiscreet, people said in his confidences, the very pink of good fellowship. The jaunty commonplaceness of his whole person was reflected in the gay colours he wore so well, in the gaudy vertical stripes of his trunk hose and the horizontal slashes of his sleeves. Philip, though of exactly the same age and much the same stature, was far more a personage. If the imperial succession had depended on royal appearance instead of on the choice of the electors, he might have considered the battle won. There was more of majesty in his severe black garments, set off only by a gold chain, than in all the bright feathers of his guest. His face was at once finer and stronger, the eyes more commanding and more alive, with that hereditary energy that had taken the form of madness in his grandmother, Juana, and of extreme irascibility in his small son, Don Carlos, the lips fuller but firmer and more determined, the face less narrow, the nose less gross, the ears more generous, the hands stronger and more shapely. In the presence of Maximilian, a physique that seemed frail beside a rock of a man like Alba took on an appearance of vitality, of well-controlled virility. If he found his cousin little changed in the outward man, he must have become aware, and that quickly, that the real Max concealed behind so much finery and frankness was different in some subtle, intangible way. Two men may dislike each other for reasons of temperament or personal rivalry, and yet feel each other a common something, larger than either, of which both are part, and on which both may safely stand. In Europe, for centuries, most men of their class had shared this common ground, could assume the same principles, could breathe the same spiritual and cultural air. There was something in a Henry IV, even in his most recalcitrant moments, that almost any Christian would expect to lead him to the snows of Canossa. Something in a Henry II, even in his wrath, that made conceivable the bearing of his royal back to the thongs at Canterbury. All Christians were members of each other, imperfectly but profoundly. All sensed in one another a common purpose and direction, if not in life, then ultimately at least in death. But a new thing had come into the world. Rather, an old thing had returned from exile, which defied even the unity of death. It was a spirit that had been rigorously excluded from the training and the mind of Philip. From earliest childhood he had thought of himself as an integral part of a spiritual entity, unquestionable and indestructible. With Spanish logic and Spanish sincerity, he had surrendered the forces of his mind and will so utterly to this unity, on whose mighty periphery he stood, a mere human being, though son to an emperor, that he found any deviation from it in others abnormal and incomprehensible. Men who were not part of that unity were working against it, whether they knew it or not. He who is not with me is against me. The new dogma of private judgment had made each one who accepted it the centre of his own universe, cut off from the past and in part from the future. It was this new orientation of the spirit, this travelling in a direction opposed to that of the church militant that Philip felt in Maximilian, must inevitably have felt in him, and resented with all his soul. Maximilian, on his part, distrusted Philip quite as much. To his more compromising spirit, fed upon the aspiration, so strong among Germans, to be free from any extraneous authority, political or religious, Philip's inflexible adherence to the Catholic idea must have been irritating, suffocating. There was something in that adamantine confidence and repose of the mind which thought with the Church, to use the phrase of St. Ignatius, that was almost a reproach and an accusation to the unorthodox. Philip's gaze might be called centripetal, that of Maximilian centrifugal. Little wonder, then, that they did not see the same things. Philip saw in the Mass the body and blood of Christ, offered to the Eternal Father as literally and as actually as on the cross of Calvary. Did Maximilian still believe what Christians had held in the catacombs and had died for in many places and many centuries? Or could he see nothing but a ceremony, a symbol? One thing they saw with common eyes, however, the desirability, or the apparent desirability, of the imperial crown. Philip seemed, at first view, to be the logical candidate. He was the son and heir of the emperor. He had more intelligence and personality than Max. He had shown a precocious aptitude for administrative work, for judging and handling human beings and human problems. He himself had a son to ensure the succession. Yes, little Don Carlos, with his big head and small feet, might yet wear the mantle of Barbarossa. It had already been decided that Philip should have the Netherlands. To make it possible to rule them, he must also have Germany and the imperial prestige. For this he had the voice of Charles, of Mary, and even of Ferdinand. He could, to be sure, give up both the Burgundian lands and the empire, and rule as a king of Spain, whose empire would lie in the New World. This would be easier, more agreeable, and less expensive. Spain was rich, Germany poor. With the peninsula alone, rich and powerful, Philip could turn all his energies to the colonization of the Americas, north as well as south, and to the dissemination of the Catholic culture through the Western Hemisphere. It is easy to imagine how such a choice might change the history of the world. What of Europe, though, in the meantime? Spain could hardly expect to remain Catholic forever if all the rest of Europe abandoned the faith. Whether or not such a wholesale apostasy occurred might well depend upon the convictions of the next emperor. Philip felt sure of himself. He had grave doubts about Maximilian, and with reason. Although the German prince still outwardly conformed to the Catholic faith, he had already become a Protestant in secret. The change in him had been accomplished quietly under the nose of King Ferdinand himself, by the court preacher, Fauser, who still posed as a Catholic. Maximilian's tutor, Wolfgang Severus, had completed the alienation of his mind from historic Christianity. Whether Philip knew this at the time of his sister's marriage is questionable, but the difference in Maximilian could hardly have escaped his observant eyes. He must have divined that more than the fate of two young men of royal blood depended upon the coming election. The very future of Christianity in Europe and throughout the world might depend on who was emperor. Under Philip the direction would be Catholic. Under Maximilian it would be Protestant. Protestant at first, and later whatever the new heresy might prove to be in essence. If this lowered the desirability of Maximilian in the eyes of Philip, it was likely to be to his advantage in other quarters. The number of Protestant imperial electors had increased of late. Moreover, there were many persons of influence in the imperial court who went to Mass and made a show of being Catholic in public, but in private was something quite other. If many were merely indifferent, a few important ones were active and insidious enemies of the faith they pretended, for business or political reasons, to serve. Most of the emperor's councillors, in fact, were but nominal Catholics. His chief minister and adviser, Gattinara, was one of those who adopted the Erasmian heresy that Erasmus himself had fathered and then cast off. His chaplain, the noted doctor, Constantino Ponce della Fuente, was already in secret communication with the followers of Luther, but at this period was so successful in carrying water on both shoulders that Prince Philip's chaplain, Calvete, could write enthusiastically that he was a very great philosopher, a profound theologian, and one of the most notable pulpit orators of all time. And his book on Christian doctrine, later condemned by the Inquisition as heretical, was a favourite of the emperor, to whom it was dedicated. Alonso Fonseca, Archbishop of Toledo, was accused before the Inquisition. Even the Inquisitor General, Alonso Manrique, was known to have Erasmian tendencies. Juan Gil, who, like Dr. Constantino, was industriously, though privately, spreading anti-Catholic doctrines, was exerting a powerful influence at the University of Alcalá, yet Charles wished to make him Bishop of Tortosa and finally rescued him from the Inquisition in 1550. Another secret Protestant was the Emperor's eloquent preacher, Agustin Cazalla, who went to Germany and the Netherlands with him, and his confessor, Juan de Quintana, had a brilliant young secretary named Michael Servetus, destined to found a new sect of Unitarians and to be burned at the stake by Calvin for denying the dogma of the Trinity. Perhaps instructed in his heresy, conjectures the Jewish historian Graetz, by the Marranos in Spain, if not one himself. Most of the secret friends of Protestantism in the imperial court were, in fact, new Christians of Jewish descent. Not even the imperial family was immune from this insidious and disrupting influence. Ferdinand was a sincere Catholic in his blundering and selfish way, but there would be a different story to tell of his children and grandchildren. Indeed, his sister, Mary of Hungary, was a conforming Catholic only because Charles had insisted that she give up her Lutheran views on becoming ruler of the Netherlands. Even Prince Philip might have become a Protestant if he had followed his desire at one time to take the great Dr. Constantino as his confessor. But his friend, Ruy Gomez, who seems to have been better informed than most people, warned him against the doctor and suggested a less famous but more reliable guide. Philip's sister, Maria, submitted to the spiritual direction of Fray Vicento de Rocamoro, seemingly a very holy and Christian priest. Later, this man threw off the mask of Catholicism and joined the Jewish community at Amsterdam under the name of Isaac of Rocamoro. More than a century had passed since Ferdinand and Isabel had expelled the Jews from Spain. The people of the peninsula were beginning to pay the price for that purging, as it was called. It was not the price imagined by so many sentimental historians. Spain was not being ruined, as school children have been told, because the Jews took away their gold and their astute commercial minds. For the number of Jews who left, probably not over 160,000, it is generally now agreed, was small compared to those who remained in the country as Marranos, baptized Catholics, some sincere, others secretly observing the rites of Judaism. These latter kept their wealth and power, made new contacts, remained in communication with the more courageous Jews who had scattered throughout Europe. The dispersion of the Jewish race, calamitous at the moment though it was, served, as usual, to increase Jewish power after a short time. This power sought and found new channels for its activity. Wherever it worked, it strove, as in past times, to destroy Catholic Christianity. Where it could not openly attack, it endeavoured to undermine and weaken the structure. Whatever may be said for the immediate political advantages of the expulsion of the Jews in 1492, it had failed in the long run and in a larger sense. Like all persecutions, it had proved of more benefit in the end to the victims than to the persecutors. Instead of expunging the evils for which it was invoked, it had merely translated them to a larger stage or driven them under cover, where they could flourish the more safely. In short, no panacea had ever healed the Jewish aversion to Christianity and ended the acts and policies that logically flowed therefrom, save pure, undiluted Christianity itself. Saints like Vincent Ferrer had caused the genuine assimilation of thousands of Jews who enriched the Spanish mind and culture with a new vitality and depth, and to such an extent that Pope Adrian VI could speak of the whole Spanish nation as the Jews. But the politicians with their expedients and compromises had left in the unconverted Jewish heart a natural human bitterness, with a thirst for revenge and a greater determination not to examine the claims of the Church. Thus, while secret Jews wound themselves into the confidence of Charles and his very family and sapped the foundations of the faith he loved under cover of some of the new fashionable opinions from the north, the new Jewish communities at various strategic points in Europe were quietly building up greater empires of economic and political strength to oppose and to plague him and his successors. If the emperor had put on the strong armour of sanctity which the church, his wife, and his conscience had often urged upon him, the result might have been different. But a Charles dallying with lusty Barbara Blomberg between fits of the gout and spurts of gluttony was no match for the Jews. True it is, he had more than once taken fitful human steps to protect his dominions from the Jews and Marranos. Returning victorious from Algiers, he had wrung from a reluctant Pope Paul III, whose kindness to the Jews was notorious, permission to revive the Inquisition in Portugal in 1531. There had been bad harvests, famine and plague. As the Jewish historian Graetz puts it, "It was commonly said, the baptized Jews are grain speculators. They make the necessities of life dear and export grain to foreign countries." The person most hated was John Rodrigo Mascarenhas, the farmer of taxes, and through him all the Marranos incurred hatred. Large numbers of the secret Jews fled to France, especially to those centres where the population already included an unsuspected number of Jews: Bordeaux, Bayonne, Nantes, La Rochelle, Toulouse, Rouen. Cities that had been strangely hospitable to the Albigensian heresy, and now nourished that of the Huguenots, and in time would furnish a good soil for liberalism and communism. Still others made their way to augment the hidden cells of Judaism in the Netherlands, and Charles permitted them to settle there. His natural tolerance permitted the Inquisition to lag, and the peace and order he maintained were ideal for commercial activities. The Jews availed themselves of their opportunity. In less than a generation, they had made Antwerp the centre of world trade and finance. There, at the convergence of great waterways, were dumped for their benefit the goods from the rivers of South and Central Germany, from the Baltic and the Sound, from the Atlantic and Mediterranean coasts, and from the Indies of both Spain and Portugal. The Jewish merchant who came and went as a Lombard, a Genoese, and an Italian, or more commonly a Portuguese, had found a new earthly paradise. He was not long in rebuilding the Jewish commercial supremacy of the Middle Ages, which had been shattered, or at least greatly restricted, by the rising of the guilds of Christian workmen. This restoration was hastened, oddly enough, by the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492 and from Portugal in 1496. Jews then fled to England, to Eastern Europe, to Africa. Many went to Turkey. On the way thither, through France and Italy, they founded or fortified Jewish communities at Lyon, Ferrara, Rome, Turin, Venice, Ancona. They went to Ragusa, to Salonika, to Constantinople, and south to Suez and Cairo. This, as Dr. Lucian Wolff reminds us, was the line of the overland trade to the Indies. It was largely on the brokerages of that trade, adds Dr. Wolff, and in some cases on direct imports from their correspondents and co-religionists in Bassora and southwest Hindustan, that the exiles lived. With the opening of the sea route to India by the Portuguese navigators, these migrations became deflected northward. For the distribution of the great quantities of Indian produce and merchandise, which now accumulated in Lisbon, a powerful syndicate was formed in that city by the great Marrano mercantile and banking houses of Francisco and Diogo Mendes, who established for the purpose warehouses and comptors in Antwerp under the management of Diogo. The firm and their partners, chiefly the Italian, Affettati, enjoyed a monopoly of the distributing trade in the north, competing with the Fuggers and the Hanseatic League, who had previously enjoyed a similar monopoly in regard to the overland trade. The Mendes house flourished exceedingly, and in the wake of Diogo, many of his relations and other Marranos settled in Antwerp. It was not long before agents of the Spice Trust, as it was called, were sent to England. The earliest seems to have been one Jorge Anes, formerly of Valladolid in Spain. Commercial relations existed between England and the Mendes Trust before 1525, and they were so important that, when Diogo Mendes was arrested in 1532 for Judaism, Henry VIII intervened for his protection. This Jewish Spice Trust of Antwerp and Lisbon played so important a part in the history of the 16th century that it is difficult to understand the silence of most modern historians as to its activities. From Jewish records, however, it is apparent, even allowing for a little boasting, that they were enormous. Not only did these secret Jews collect a toll on goods consumed in every corner in Europe and at both ends of the line of distribution, but they exercised an incalculable influence upon the social, political, and religious life of the people among whom they moved. In each important commercial centre there must have been a good proportion of merchants from Spain and Portugal. Indeed, there were good reasons at that time for suspecting that such a member of the Iberian commercial establishments in Europe or in the colonies was a Marrano. The Spice Trust was also a usury syndicate on a large scale. Money lending had served the Jews well during the eclipse of their commercial empire in the period of the guilds, and it remained a source of great profit. Perhaps this partly explains also the commercial bent of the Calvinistic communities. At any rate, a new international bank of worldwide ramifications had arisen. The House of Mendez, or Nassi, as it came to be called, was already encroaching on the empire of the Catholic Fuggers, who had financed the election of Charles and once tore up a note of his when he was in difficulties. The Fuggers were usurers in the light of Catholic principles, quite as much as the Jews were, but Mendez generally got higher interest. Diogo Mendez, head of the Antwerp branch of this banking house, had a wife named Gracia, known as the Esther of her time and an inveterate foe of the Church Catholic. She had fled to Antwerp with her daughter, Reina, and her nephew, João, or Joseph Miguez. This Joseph was a young man of uncommon charm and adroitness. It was not long before he had many of the most influential young noblemen of the Netherlands in his debt. The emperor himself owed him a large sum for 2 years. The emperor's sister, Mary, gave him her favour and protection, and threw the weight of her advice against the enforcement of the Inquisition. Joseph Nassi, as he began calling himself after a while, married Reina. He was on his way to becoming a sort of uncrowned king of the Jews. He and his relatives might be called the Rothschilds of the 16th century. Joseph Miguez and his associates in the Spice Trust found it convenient in the then state of Europe to build up a vast and elaborate system of spies stretching from England to Constantinople, and obviously a weapon of the greatest political as well as economic importance. Spice ships from Portugal and others laden with immigrants for the Netherlands would first land at an English port, where Jewish messengers from London with the latest news from the continent would meet them and tell them whether the coast was clear. If not, they would disembark, usually at Hampton, now Southampton, proceed to London and wait a favourable chance to continue their journey to Antwerp. The chief link in the chain of espionage at London was a Marrano merchant named Christopher Fernandez. A money changer named Antonio Loringue conducted a brisk trade selling bills on Antwerp to the voyagers, for they were not allowed to carry Portuguese money out of England. When the emperor at last saw what was going on in his northern dominions, it was too late to do much about it. Indeed, he himself had played into the hands of the Jews only too effectively when, under severe financial stress in 1529, he had mortgaged his interest in the Moluccas, whose wealth Magellan had opened up for him. The monopoly of the spice trade thus passed to Portugal, and thence to the power of the Jews. As late as 1548, the Castilian Cortes petitioned Charles to resume this great alienated treasure, but Charles's necessities forbade. In 1540, Charles was alarmed by information reaching him that the Marranos he had allowed to settle in Antwerp were proselytizing against the Christian religion. He ordered his officials there to arrest all new Christians suspected of Judaizing and to punish any who failed to denounce them. At the end of the year, a group of Marranos, men, women, and children, were tried at Middlesbrough and compelled to take an oath that they were truly Catholics and would remain so. The international character of the movement under investigation is illustrated by the fact that one of the accused, Thomas Fernandez of Viana, had been born in Ireland. In 1542, the Bohemian Diet banished all Jews from Bohemia on the ground that they were supplying to the Turks information about Christian military preparations. The exiles went to Poland or Turkey. 3 years later, during his siege of Metz, Charles was informed that Marranos from Spain and Portugal were secretly shipping arms and munitions to the Turks for use against Christendom and the Empire. He ordered the arrest of suspected merchants in Germany, Italy, and elsewhere, and the confiscation of the goods of the guilty. In 1549, he expelled the Marranos from Antwerp. Many, of course, remained as Catholics. Others migrated to England as Protestants. Philip, even at this period, saw the Jewish situation more realistically than Charles did. Hence it was already believed among Jews and Protestants that, when he succeeded Charles, the Inquisition would come to life again, both in Spain and in the Netherlands. It is still the fashion for historians to explain gravely that this was because Philip was Spanish in temperament and education, while Charles was cosmopolitan. It would be nearer the truth to say that the prince was beginning to see the two cosmopolitan forces at work in that 16th century world, the internationalism of the Catholic Church and the internationalism of the Jews. Philip, growing up under the eyes of the most intelligent and uncorrupted clergy on the whole in the world, thought more with the Church and less in grooves suggested by the Jews. His precocious distrust of the Marranos may have owed something to the teachings of Dr. Silizio. At any rate, one of the first acts of Philip's old tutor on becoming Archbishop of Toledo had been to exclude all priests of Jewish descent from the chapter of the Holy Church there. For this race, explains the contemporary chronicler Sandoval with a strange mixture of prejudice and charity, is so malignant that it takes scarcely one to unsettle many. Christian charity does not forbid us to embrace all who may sin mortally, and I know that in the sight of God there is no distinction between Gentile and Jew, for one alone is Lord of all. But who can deny that there persists and endures in the descendants of Jews the evil tendency of their ancient ingratitude and ill understanding, as in the Negroes the inseparable accident of their blackness? For if these mate with white wives 1,000 times, the children are born with the dark colour of their fathers. So with the Jews it is not enough to be 3 parts Hidalgo or Christian of the old stock, but the slightest provocation serves to pervert them and make them to all intents and purposes Jews, extremely dangerous in communities. Thus the Spanish patriot, even in the stress of his age-long struggle with Mohammedan and Jew, saw clearly the mind of the Church. In the sight of God there is no distinction between Gentile and Jew, but often did violence to that principle in the name of expediency. To justify what must appear to the modern Catholic as an unchristian discrimination, he would plead that it was better to exclude a whole race than to allow an entire community to lose the faith. He seems to have been singularly blind to the possibility of ousting any priest who became heretical, whether of Jewish descent or not, on that safe ground alone, without reference to race. This, in fact, is what the Inquisition attempted. The newly founded Society of Jesus had the same dilemma to face. St. Ignatius made no racial distinctions. His secretary, Polanco, the only person present at his deathbed, was of Jewish descent. So was Lainez, one of his first and greatest converts, who brought back thousands to the Catholic faith and succeeded the saint as general of the order. In a short time, as the young Jesuit organization became a power for Catholic reform and propaganda, Jews were attracted to it, as they are always attracted to centers of influence, in such numbers that it was found difficult to keep out those who wished to destroy the order and the church under pretext of working for them. Thus a nephew of the great and Catholic Jew Polanco followed him into the society and caused such difficulties and dissensions that for years he nearly drove his superiors to despair. Philip, at 21, took the traditional Spanish Catholic view of this problem. The world, in his view, was divided into 2 principal parts: Christendom, the kingdom of Christ on earth, of which Spain had been, was, and would be the chief defender, and the kingdom of Antichrist, growing up like tares in the fields of wheat, a tacit federation of Jews, Marranos, Mohammedans, the various squabbling sects of Protestants, and the lukewarm or fatuously blind or hypocritical Catholics boring from within to the advantage of the enemy without. It is probable enough that he considered his cousin Maximilian in this hostile camp, and therefore separated by a great spiritual gulf. Nevertheless, it was the emperor's wish that the German prince be married to Maria as soon as possible. Philip, putting his own feelings aside, hastened with all courtesy to arrange a magnificent royal wedding. As soon as he learned that Maximilian had reached Olivares, 5 leagues from Madrid, he hurried to meet him and to give him, according to Calvete, one of the greatest receptions that any prince ever received. On September 17th, 1548, he escorted him back to the city with fitting love and courtesy. That evening, in the ancient palace where Ferdinand and Isabel had been married in defiance of King Henry IV, Maximilian and Maria were pronounced man and wife by Cardinal Madruccio of Trent, a prince of the empire, with Philip and Juana as their padrinos. Next morning the cardinal said mass and veiled the bride and bridegroom. The usual feasts, tourneys, bullfights, games, and gorgeous Renaissance banquets followed, with all the new Flemish ostentation that Philip detested. 3 or 4 days after the wedding, a comedy of Ariosto was presented, possibly La Casaria or La Lena. It was the first recorded performance of an Italian comedy in Spain, and the first known use in Spain of the scenic contraptions of the Renaissance. Hence, perhaps, the failure of Calvete to tell us the name of the play. There is no evidence at this period of that dislike for the theatre which has been attributed to Philip. While he was entertaining Maximilian and covering with Castilian courtesy both his dislike and his eagerness to be off on his journey, he was making preparations to depart. More than once he must have retired to his own chamber, safe from the prying eyes of major-domos, chamberlains, and varlets of sundry degrees, to read over a letter written by the emperor during the summer and delivered at Alcalá during the fiestas. It was a long document, covering several pages of parchment, sealed with lead, a document of utmost importance. It contained the advice of the ablest ruler of his time, at a moment when he believed himself face to face with death. For all Philip knew, his father might even then be dead. "Son," the emperor began, simply, in his vigorous colloquial style, "since the labours I have passed through have brought back upon me certain diseases, and lately I have found myself in danger of my life, considering what might befall me according to God's will, it has seemed good to me to advise you in this letter that I should wish in such a case, for the chief and firm foundation of your good governing, you ought always acknowledge that all your being and welfare come from the infinite mercy of God, and submit your desires and actions to his will, and that he may enlighten you and be most propitious, you ought to hold always very dear the observance, support, and defence of our holy Catholic faith, favouring due justice, and commanding that it be enforced scrupulously, without respect of persons, and against all suspicious and guilty ones, taking care to oppose by all ways and means you can with law and reason the heresies and sects contrary to our ancient faith and religion." He advised Philip to cultivate the friendship of his uncle Ferdinand, who would be next emperor, and to labour with him for a general council of the Church, always to be obedient to the Holy Apostolic See and to respect it, and if under pretext or shadow of it there should be any abuse or encroachment to his prejudice, to seek redress with due reverence and without causing scandal. He should take great care that the churches, dignities, and benefices whose nomination belonged to him should be filled with persons of learning, experience, good life, and example. And since the thing that God has most commended to us is peace, without which he cannot be well served, besides those other infinite troubles that wars bring and are followed by, you ought always to avoid them by all possible ways and means, and never enter upon them except by compulsion, and when God and the world know and see that you can do no less. This was all the more necessary for Philip, because the kingdoms he would rule were now weary and exhausted by the recent wars, to which I have always been forced for their defence and to prevent their oppression. And because this alone was Charles's motive, God has aided me so that I have not only kept them, but have added to them. He had always been careful not to drain money from his lands, and he charged Philip to avoid it absolutely, except perhaps in Flanders, which was rich and should aid against the Turks and the Lutherans. As for the 5-year truce with the Mohammedans, which the emperor had arranged with the General Council in view, Philip should observe it scrupulously on his side and keep good faith with all men, whether they were infidels or others. He should not rest content with keeping the Turk out of his own lands, but should help to exclude them from Germany, and especially from Italy, so that the French will have no excuse to disturb and trouble Christendom as they have done in the past. As for Pope Paul III, Charles complained of his bad treatment in the past war and in the matter of a general council, but Philip should treat the Pope not according to his acts, but with the respect due his office. Such were the considerations that filled the mind of the sick emperor. All the problems that had tormented him for 30 years were now reduced to a few tremendous necessities: serving God and the Church, the reform of the Church with the end of German Protestantism especially in view, and the need of peace and its improbability, a just balancing of the rights of the Holy See and those of the Spanish crown, and money, always money. There was nothing, however, about the situations that would give most trouble to his son: the financial and economic affairs of Spain, the danger to arise from the permanent alienation of England from the Catholic unity, the danger that France, already more deeply penetrated by heresy than Charles realized, might also join the enemy, the simultaneous growth of heretical and Jewish powers in the Netherlands. Nothing was said of any opposition to Philip's being emperor after the death of Ferdinand, or of the tremendous anti-Catholic forces which would pit his cousin Maximilian against him in the hope of transferring all Middle Europe and Germany from the Catholic to the anti-Catholic side. Charles could not foresee all this, neither at that time could Philip. The galleys of Doria, in which Maximilian had come from Italy, were waiting for him at Barcelona. The season of storms had come, and people were saying that it would be better to wait until spring. But Philip refused to consider a postponement. While the marriage festivities were still in progress, he sent his fine stud of horses, his pages, and other household impedimentos ahead to the eastern coast, and with them orders that fresh mounts be held in readiness at each post. One more difficulty remained to dispose of before he could leave. The Cortes was in session in Valladolid, and Philip had to ask the procuradores for the money to pay for his journey. They objected to the expense, they objected to the loss of trade his absence would cause, and above all they objected to absentee rulership. It was bad enough that Charles had spent so much on his Burgundian court and his wars, but even worse that he had lived so much out of Spain. They hoped Philip was not going to follow his bad example. Spain was good enough for them. They wished a Spanish monarch who would live in Spain and attend to its affairs. It required all of the prince's tact and insistence to get what he wanted. If he had not been so popular, he might have asked in vain. It was October 1st before he was able to send his Correo Mayor ahead with the news that he was about to leave. Next morning, at the head of a gallant and sparkling company, he rode through the gates of Valladolid and down into the open country. With the best horses in Spain, fresh at every post, it took him 5 days to ride at top speed from Valladolid to Zaragoza, and 12 to reach the port of Barcelona. 1 day in the teeth of a drenching rain and a howling tempest. On the night of the 5th day, they entered Zaragoza. On October 10th in the afternoon, they came within sight of the monastery of Our Lady of Montserrat, clinging to the green-covered side of that holy mountain where the Blessed Virgin had appeared to the eyes of men, had confirmed her apparition with marvels and cures. A miraculous statue of her and the child Jesus had been venerated there for centuries, except in those moments of peril when the monks hid it away from the Moors, as they were to do from liberal Masonic foes in the 19th century and from communists in the 20th. It was at the feet of that statue that Ignatius Loyola laid his sword and first dreamed of his company. Philip was in a tremendous hurry, but it would never have occurred to him to rush by so holy a place without stopping to pray and to confess his sins. Offering gifts and alms, he commended himself to Our Lady and begged for good success for his voyage, and left for Barcelona. They went for supper and entertainment to the house of Donna Estefania de Requesens, a widow lately married to Philip's old fencing master, Don Juan de Zuniga, a woman so excellent and rare, adds Calvete, that she needed only to have lived in past times to be celebrated and kept in perpetual memory. After 3 days in Barcelona, Philip went to Rosas, where the fleet was waiting. His father had once said that he never felt so much like an emperor as when going up that grand sweep of stairs in the Alcazar at Toledo. Philip must have realized what it meant to be born to rule when he saw glittering and rolling in the afternoon sunshine the great Imperial fleet drawn up in battle order. Over the dark hulls of the vessels of many nations fluttered a multitude of banners, standards, pennons and streamers and gonfalons of crimson damask worked with gold and silver and of diverse other colours, and over all the arms of the Holy Roman Empire and of Holy Spain. The admiral of the fleet, Prince Andrea Doria of Genoa, with many other Genoese gentlemen, came ashore to receive him. Cabrera, who otherwise follows the narrative of Calvete, puts in here on his own account that Doria was so impressed by the majestic and handsome appearance of Philip that he turned his eyes to heaven and cried, Nunc dimittis servum tuum, Domine, qui videret ocule mea salutare tuum. The artillery of the fleet welcomed Prince Philip with firing so fast and furious that it appeared that heaven and earth were being overwhelmed with thunder and fire. Trumpets and clarions then sounded from one end of the fleet to the other, with much concert and harmony. As Philip arrived at the Bastarda, he heard a very soft music of minstrels and other instruments without cease, until he stepped on the tapestried deck to review the whole fleet. The sea was as calm and smooth as a mirror, but that night a furious wind blew up with heavy rain, so that it appeared the elements had conspired to prevent the voyage. The sea ran so high that many of the ships were in danger of foundering or crashing on the rocks, and had to seek harbour where they could. Many of the crews went ashore, but found the rivers and arroyos in flood, cutting off the roads and leaving Prince Philip marooned in Castillon for 11 days. His Highness did not waste the time, but gave his constant attention to carrying on and finishing many matters pertaining to the public good of the kingdoms of Spain. Not until October 31st did the sea grow quiet enough to permit embarkation. It was no simple task to store a fleet of 58 galleys with the supplies, luggage, accoutrements, and accessories of a whole court. One might say with truth that this assembly was a great part of the young cavaliers of Spain and sons of her grandees and chief lords and knights. The prince's 60 horses and his wardrobe required a separate galley, his chapel and his pages a third. Each of the great lords had a galley. The Cardinal of Trent had one for his person and another for the gentlemen and attendants of his household. There was much shouting of men, blowing of horns, neighing of horses. In less than 48 hours, the huge fleet was loaded and ready to sail. A glance at the list of Duarte, then Commissary General, which Calvete prints in fragments, would give a good cross-section view of the whole life and culture of Spain almost at the height of her glory. If the noblest and most ancient houses were represented, so were the trades, arts and professions, and all that vast and teeming intellectuality which made the Spanish universities so illustrious. Soldiers, sailors, scientists, poets, theologians, musicians, sculptors and painters, a papal nuncio and other bishops, the blind organist Cabezon, a painter and illuminator of surpassing cunning, Diego de Arroyo, whom none of our age surpass in illumination and painting, and many others of whom Calvete forbears to write, for their excellence is such that the other nations understand that today in Spain there flourish not only military science and skill in arms, but also letters and the liberal and mechanical arts. All the world, it might be said, was represented on those galleys of the emperor, including not a few distinguished Moranos, such as Dr. Constantino. But at last the men, horses, and provisions of various sorts were safely stowed, the wind was favourable, and all made ready. On November 1st, All Saints' Day, Philip heard Mass at the church of Castellon. The divine office was rendered with great solemnity, and Dr. Constantino preached as excellently as ever. The slender sickle of a new moon was in the western sky over the Catalonian mountains, The scene was lovely and peaceful, but old sailors saw in the moon certain signs, says Calvete, without telling what, that the weather would not be favourable. On November 2nd, the sea was calm enough, and the huge galley of the prince spread her brown wings and floated majestically out into the open sea, with all the others following. It was the custom then, as it has been even in modern times, for Spanish sailors, in whatever waters they chanced to be, to chant in chorus the beautiful Salve Regina as a vesper hymn to the Blessed Virgin when daylight left the sea. So it was with Philip's first day on shipboard. It took him 25 days to go from the eastern coast of Spain to Genoa. He narrowly escaped being killed by a falling rock at Elna. On November 7th, the weather was so foul that the galleys had to use their oars, and the prospect was so bad that old sailors wished either to wait for the storms to pass or to return to Spain. Philip alone was determined to go on, knowing that the delay meant the postponement of his voyage until the following spring. The royal spirit of the prince was well revealed, for only his constancy and firmness that day gave them all courage to continue their voyage, and they all knew much more the grandeur of soul with which God had endowed him, when, as the sea became very high and furious, and the Galera Bastarda began to roll so badly that it was necessary for other galleys to throw out ropes for her, and 3 on each side of her shielded her from the waves, steadying her lest she overturn. He, although warned and implored to pass into another galley, refused to leave the one in which he was. At the Isle of Eras they ran into more stormy weather, which continued so long that their food ran short, and even hard tack became scarce. When they passed Monago, the winds began to howl again, and they had to row furiously in the teeth of a storm to make Porto Morici. But on November 24th, a Genoese galley appeared. On the following Sunday, a cry of joy arose from ship after ship as the beautiful shore of Genoa appeared, with gardens full of orange and olive trees, and little villages and pleasure houses standing out amid the greenery. The fleet entered the harbour in battle order. As guns thundered from the castles and the city walls, Philip descended a ladder into a small boat and went ashore to the gorgeous palace of Doria, the king of the sea. At every street he passed under a triumphal arch emblazoned with the sententious wisdom and fulsome Roman flattery of the Renaissance. He saw a representation of himself riding in a triumphal car with Virtue, to whom he was saying, "Virtue, where goest thou without me?" While some old men kneeling before him answered, "His deeds befit the words." And at the feet of the armed prince were none other than Venus and her blind bow-boy with the inscription, "True Domination." It does not appear whether this referred to the rumours of negotiations for a second marriage with another Portuguese cousin, or with Mary Tudor, or to those whisperings, still unverified, that he had a mistress or a morganatic wife named Donna Isabel Osorio. There were added to this picture, for good measure, the persons of King Artaxerxes of Persia, Publius Scipio, the nymph Amalthea, some centaurs, and Hercules, killing one of them. Doria's palace, with its magnificent view of the harbour and the sea, was undoubtedly one of the most beautiful in the world. Its gardens were rare, its fountains exquisite, its marble walks and monuments marvellously wrought by the most cunning artists. Deep within its almost oriental luxury and quiet, Prince Philip had an apartment adorned with incredible tapestries of gold and silk, on which were worked all the stories that the poets tell of Jupiter. There was a canopy of mulberry-coloured velvet bordered with brocade and fringed with gold, and in the midst the imperial escutcheon with the royal arms of Spain, worked on cloth of gold and silver. Within there were chambers and antechambers, and a wardrobe with its closets, all soft with silks and splendid with cloth of gold. The Duke of Alba's quarters, adjoining those of the prince, were similarly hung with tapestries and cloth of gold, and the silks there were of Moorish manufacture from Granada. The chroniclers considered it worthy of mention that Doria would allow his guests to use nothing but of his provision, and they marvelled especially at the service, which was so silent that the men who performed it were not heard or felt, but it appeared as if the service was done by itself, as they are wont to tell of the time when tables were set by enchantment. The objectivity of these 16th century narrators is irritating to the modern reader. A few pages from a diary by Philip, setting down what he thought of all this Arabian Nights atmosphere, would be more than welcome. But there is no diary. What is known is that Philip, at every period of his life, manifested a hearty dislike for vanity and effusion of all sorts. He hated flattery and flatterers. His own tastes and habits were simple. It may be legitimate to imagine him, therefore, sighing wearily as he sank into the silks of his gilded couch and wishing for the comparative but rich simplicity of the palace at Aranjuez, where he used to hear the nightingales in the orange trees on summer nights, or for the severe dignity of Valladolid. During his 15 days in Genoa, there were continual feasts and fireworks. Potentates came from all parts of Italy to visit the son of their overlord. Papal nuncios called to observe and went away to report. Rich gifts of beasts, jewels, silks, velvets accumulated, and 13,000 scudi, a most useful present, arrived from Messina. Ottavio Farnese brought from his uncle Pope Paul III a sword and hat blessed by His Holiness on Christmas Eve, with the hope that Philip might one day be the true champion of Holy Church. Yet all this while Philip was in a sense a prisoner in his gilded cage. He was so busy receiving the countless ambassadors, prelates, lords, friends and petitioners that he could not leave the palace until December 6th. Besides, Calvete adds naively, the Signori asked him not to appear in public until they had finished the triumphal arches being raised throughout the city for his reception. Possibly, too, the imperial visitor was not as welcome among the Genoese as the emperor was led to believe. Many Italians hated the lordly Spanish quite as much as they detested the French. The depths of this resentment became apparent the first week in December, when one of the Spanish soldiers killed a native of the city. The citizens seized their arms and poured into the streets with a furious uproar. 2 or 3 riots resulted. One of them almost developed into a pitched battle between the Spanish and the Genoese, but Prince Philip appeased the latter by having a young Spanish noble arrested and sent back to Spain. He was not sorry to get away from Genoa. Milan was better. The people welcomed him with almost delirious ostentation, December 20th. Although he was ill there for 2 days, he appeared very happy during the round of Christmas festivities, danced with evident enjoyment, and won all hearts by his graciousness and liberality. The Princess of Ascoli, wife of the governor, gave a splendid ball in his honour. Philip showed his appreciation by sending her a diamond worth 5,000 ducats, with a string of rubies, pearls and diamonds for her daughter. Wherever he went, indeed, his liberality was praised. Even the Italian Protestant chronicler, Gregorio Leti, whose accounts of Philip is not always flattering, marvels at his infinite acts of generous benefice. To most Italians, he seemed the very perfection of a humanist prince. They spoke of his gracious manners, his unfailing patience, his grave but good-humoured courtesy on all occasions, his temperance in eating and drinking, his courage in moments of danger, and his intense dislike of all unnecessary violence, his intelligent appreciation of music, architecture and painting, his joy in the comedies of the divine Ludovico that were presented for him at Milano, his tact in turning boors and office-seekers aside with polite but non-committal replies when they begged him to get the emperor to do this or that. In a youth of 21, such qualities, united to a sincere but unostentatious piety, seemed to promise a future emperor who would love and understand Italy better than Ferdinand or Charles had done. On the first day of the new year, the Milanese showed their admiration by giving him 20,000 scudi in gold. Venetian observers criticised his gravity, but that was to be expected. After another short illness, he left the Lombard city January the 8th, 1549, and continued the tiresome journey on horseback with an escort of imperial troops to Mantua and Villafranca. Thence through the Tyrol he proceeded to Namur. It was a different world into which he was going, and one of which he had had no experience. With his Latin distaste for German, a barbarous jargon to his ear, and with his Englishman's awkwardness with all foreign tongues, he was isolated to a degree unforeseen by the emperor from the minds of the northern men he was to rule. Though he held his own audiences and made his own decisions, speaking in Latin and being answered in French, which he understood well, Alba had to be always at his side on public occasions. This pleased the Flemings very little. The very virtues that endeared him to well-bred Italians and Spaniards won him the dislike of the Netherlanders, and even more so of the Germans. The glib assumption of so many prejudiced historians, repeated with parrot-like stupidity from century to century. He was never seen to smile. His aspect was sour and forbidding, may be dismissed as inconsistent with much reliable contemporary evidence to the contrary. There was some lack of sympathy between Philip and his father's northern subjects, and is much more to his credit than to theirs. We have Luther's word for the orgies of gluttony, drunkenness and lasciviousness that followed his liberation of the northern man from the trammels of Roman culture, and there was not much exaggeration in the report of Venetian ambassador that, among the Germans, overeating was considered a virtue, and cupidity, among the Calvinists especially, a synonym for superior industry, and that when a German was sober he was thought to be ill. To Charles, born and reared in the Netherlands, this was all natural enough, and the Flemings liked him all the better for his huge feeding and drinking, and his hearty familiarity. But Philip, to whom beer was an unknown and sour concoction, and wine something to take a little of with one's meals, found men very offensive who urged him to try what he detested, and to drink more than he wanted, or of what he liked. Not only was he Spanish in his temperance, he had literally no stomach for that sort of thing. Nothing but a remarkable filial devotion could have overcome his disgust. When Charles told him he ought to drink more wine in public, he obediently made the attempt, and was sick in consequence. It is no wonder that the Flemings, as Cabrera ruefully acknowledges, liked him less than they liked the emperor. The very popularity of his father made the son less agreeable by contrast to good fat Dutchmen and Walloons with skins stuffed out like sausages. Another disadvantage which is overlooked by Prescott and his imitators even to our day was the knowledge which gossip had carried before him that in religion, then a burning issue in the north, Philip was already an uncompromising Catholic who could be depended upon, if he became emperor, to use all his influence against Protestantism. What is commonly forgotten is that the spirit which hated the Catholic Church used the same means then as today to draw men of influence and power within its circle. Failing to proselytize them, it turned upon them an extraordinary power of calumny, working through many channels of public and secret propaganda, exaggerating their faults, misrepresenting what was good in them, and did so, if possible, preventing impartial or neutral minds from giving them even a hearing. It is hardly to be imagined that this spirit, so evident in every age, failed to undermine Philip's reputation as soon as he appeared on that northern battlefield of religious ideas. The Jews and Marranos, who had become a political and financial power there, who had influenced Mary of Hungary against the Inquisition, and had offered mountains of gold to the Flemings to suppress it throughout the reign of Charles, were hardly likely to welcome the pupil of Dr. Salizio or to make smooth his path any more than expediency demanded. They were already in control of a great part of the new printing industry. They were already publishing thousands of Protestant Bibles and tracts in the Netherlands for secret distribution in France, Italy, and even in Spain, and they were already circulating whispers discreditable to Philip. Add to this the denunciatory powers of the reformed preachers. Add to it the political animus of the French ambassadors, to whom some of the slighting remarks about the prince at Brussels are surely traceable. Add to it also the strong undercurrent of German Protestant intrigue, which already sensed the utility of placing Maximilian rather than his cousin on the imperial throne. Add all this, and it becomes evident enough that the cards were pretty well stacked against the visitor before he arrived, and that the warmth and magnificence of his public receptions were a tribute to the emperor rather than to him. This was especially noticeable when he entered Brussels on the first day of April. The emperor had recovered sufficiently to leave Augsburg and had come to establish his capital there for the nonce. The whole court was with him, to the joy of tradesmen and moneylenders. With him also were his sisters, Queen Mary of Hungary and Queen Eleanor of France. The whole city, therefore, made a Roman holiday of Philip's arrival. The crowds that surrounded him were so large and affectionate that it took him until night to make his way to the palace. There he was greeted by his royal aunts and subjected to the usual family inspection of a grown-up nephew last seen in skirts. It is hardly to be supposed that he enjoyed this, especially as the attitude of his aunts was somewhat critical. He seemed to them small of body, compared to the Germans, wrote Cabrera, adding, with Spanish loyalty, as if the human body were not a cage, which the soul inhabits so briefly and narrowly, and yet on taking flight finds the circuit of the sky itself too small. Queen Mary of Hungary in particular, with her shallow views of a broad-minded Catholic, must have made Philip wish that he was back in Spain, where he could talk and laugh freely and not be misunderstood. One imagines him taking refuge in silence and giving her more than one of his oblique looks, like those of an artist studying the lines and colours of some new and interesting object. She was a very small, spare woman of 45, with a thick underlip and a dark fringe of moustache on her upper one, always moving, talking, never at rest, with a mannish walk and a mannish voice, and a pontifical assurance in expressing opinions. She had read widely, but not thoughtfully. An expert horsewoman, she hunted much, and had an unerring aim with a crossbow. She was almost everything that Philip disliked in a woman. So he was not as large as the Germans. This did not make him esteem either the Germans or his Aunt Mary any better. He made a great effort, however, to please the people of Brussels, and seems to have succeeded. The populace, strongly Catholic, liked and admired him, even if he said little and laughed less. According to Gregorio Leti, he was received there with extraordinary affection, and, all the more since they saw him at the age of 22, endowed with grave discourse, skilful in his replies, mature in his deliberations, easily comprehending the most difficult matters, prudent in speaking his opinion in affairs of importance, judicious and no less informed of the intrigues of the world than any other politician of long experience, possessing, in fact, all the qualities of a great king, on which account the emperor, from that moment when he found him thus advanced since they had last met, began to take counsel with him on all the most weighty affairs of the empire and the monarchy. Philip was naturally at a disadvantage with heavier and stronger men in tournaments, yet he played his part with courage and spirit. On 2 occasions in the great park of the palace beyond the gardens and the labyrinth, he received the prize for jousting. He won the splendid ruby offered in the tourney for the ladies, in which he broke lances gallantly with the German Count Mansfeld, one of the most renowned soldiers of Europe, the shock flinging the pieces high in the air, while the people roared approval, and the emperor and the queen rejoiced, seeing his son so good a cavalier. At another tourney, Philip was knocked off his horse by a young man whom he later raised to high command, Don Luis de Requesens, son of his old tutor, Zuniga, and the incomparable Lady Estefania. To the consternation of the emperor and the great crowd, the prince lay stretched on the field as if dead, and was carried away unconscious. He came to, none the worse, and returned to the tilting yard on various occasions, notably on March 15th of the following year, when he won another prize in the Palace Park at Brussels, breaking his lances, says Cabrera, with gallantry and skill. Notwithstanding all this, the prejudice that was beginning to create a black legend about his name has curiously persisted in misrepresenting his conduct in the tournament. Major Hume, relating the praises of his courtly chroniclers, such as Calvete, says that less partial judges do not scruple to say that at one of the tourneys during his stay in Germany, on his way home, no one did so badly as the prince, who was never able to break a lance. He neglects to add that this was part of a spiteful report by the French ambassadors, who had a political interest in depreciating Philip's stock. Prescott is more fair in warning the reader against the animus of Marillac, but he cannot resist putting in gratuitously, "Whatever may have been Philip's success in these chivalrous displays, it is quite certain that they were not to his taste. He took part in them only to conform to his father's wishes and to the humour of the age. Though in his youth he sometimes hunted, he was neither fond of field sports nor of the athletic exercises of chivalry." Thus the sinister picture of the great antagonist of Protestantism, who went hunting every year until after he was 70, as one who preferred the gloom of dark chambers where deep intrigues were laid and poisonings planned, is kept consistent, even if the truth has to suffer a little. The truth is, on the contrary, that the prince's youthful love of sport and pleasure surprised and even disturbed the emperor's counsellors. Although Granvelle admitted to Queen Mary that the German lords did not welcome his coming, and took his taciturnity and retiring manners for ignorance, our prince, he admitted, is doing his best with the electors and the German princes. He speaks Latin with them. If this goes on, it looks as if all may yet be saved. He often goes out to join their sports, and is to take part in a tourney next Thursday, to be present at which the Duchess of Lorraine, Christina, daughter of Christian II, will have to remain here 2 days over. The sooner she goes the better, and I shall do the best I can to send her off, though I fear my zeal will not best please the lovers. Philip enjoyed the art treasures of Brussels, and spent much time wandering about its beautiful old churches, studying their architecture and history. He was especially interested in the collegiate church of St. Gudule, with its great clock, whose gilded dial between the two high towers was so large that one could count the hours from the farthest end of the town. Inside there was a chapel of singular edificio, on whose stained glass windows the prince saw images of his father and his 2 royal aunts, and yonder, as large and natural as life, his own form and face and those of his dead wife, Maria. High above the royal figures were other windows unfolding the story that made St. Gudule's unique, and the peculiar object of a hatred that would end some years later, 1579, in its desecration. It was the explanation of a much-visited altar in the adjoining main chapel, where, in a custodia of gold, were 3 consecrated hosts. On every feast of Corpus Christi they were borne at the head of a procession through the city, while clergy, nobles, and members of various guilds followed, and knelt in the dust before them, in reparation for their theft and desecration by some Jews in Holy Week 1370. Under the paintings representing this event was a Latin poem, in letters of gold ending, En vida Judeum, quem dem lanere laborot, impietas, meritas ignibus ecce ruit, quare age, devinus huic funde viator honores, fundo Deo digna supplice mente preces. In translating this into Spanish, Calvete adds a little on his own account. His Iberian fervour against the Jews leading him to render invida impietas as los invidiosos y cruelos judeos, throwing in the cruelty for good measure, thus illustrating the human process by which the iniquities of Jews were often magnified in the course of time. On the whole, it is impossible for an honest historian to ignore the whole account, as Jews desire, when many generations of Belgians accepted it, and when so much real evidence exists, unfortunately, to prove that such crimes against the Blessed Sacrament were committed. Of all the experiences of Philip's in Brussels, his meeting with his father after a separation of 6 years must have been the most moving, and as painful to him in a way as it was agreeable to the emperor. Philip had become such a man as Charles might have wished. Charles had changed visibly and terribly. At 49 he was prematurely old, his gouty foot perpetually on a chair, death's hand already plain on his wasted and ashen face. His protruding lower jaw, with its bad teeth that failed to meet the upper ones, seemed sharper. His mouth hung perpetually open, especially when he was tormented by asthma. His wars were almost ended. Barbara Blomberg had been pensioned off, and her child sent secretly to Spain. Caesar's thoughts were turning once more to the monastery, where he hoped to do penance for his sins in the short time that remained to him. His one aim now was to establish Philip as his successor in the imperial chair. To that end he devoted much of the next year. He had summoned the Diet to meet in Augsburg June 29th, 1550, with the hope that Philip would be named his coadjutor. He obtained the consent of Mary and Ferdinand to a compromise whereby all would urge the electors to make Philip King of the Romans, a title then held by Ferdinand, and after Ferdinand's death, Emperor, with the understanding that Maximilian should then be King of the Romans and should succeed Philip as Emperor. It all depended on the electors. Ferdinand and Maximilian apparently knew them better than Charles did. It was not until the Emperor began to carry out the first steps of the scheme that he learned to what extent his compromising with Protestantism had undermined his power, until it was hardly more than a shadow of what he had once held. He and Philip and the two queens left Brussels for Augsburg at the end of May. Scarcely had they arrived when Maximilian suddenly appeared. Quietly notified by his father, he had ridden pell-mell from Spain to protect his claim. Just what happened in the next few crucial weeks is not wholly clear. Mary is said to have seconded Charles's proposal to make Philip his coadjutor. On the other hand, Sandoval reports that Ferdinand told her that if Philip had the empire in addition to Spain and Italy, the weight of it would be too great, and he had the limitations of a human being, and that she passed this argument on to Charles. Calvete had eyes for little except ceremony and exterior display. Cabrera, however, who had access to first-hand information, gives the impression that Queen Mary, still perhaps half a Lutheran at heart, was playing a double game with Charles and Philip. Together with some of the emperor's trusted ministers, unnamed, she worked very secretly, he says, to defeat Philip and place Maximilian on the imperial throne. The argument with which she finally prevailed was that Philip's election would be fatal to German peace on account of the religious disputes. In other words, Philip seems to have lost the empire chiefly because he was a staunch Catholic, and because the anti-Catholic forces were working together with more purpose and organisation than either Charles or his son suspected. As a German, Maximilian had a further advantage among German electors. When Philip set out at last for home, his chances of becoming emperor seemed slight to many, but good to him. He trusted in the promises of Ferdinand, Maximilian, and Mary. Homesick, however, for Spain, where the very atmosphere was Catholic, and heresy feared to parade its arrogance in the sunlight, he liked Germany and Flanders even less than before. This is not to be wondered at, perhaps, when the finest spirits of the north confessed to habitual feelings of despondence, as if the world had already entered upon a beginning of sorrows. In the northern countries that had thrown off allegiance to Rome, in fact in every northern country except Ireland, there was a veritable epidemic of fornication, gluttony and suicide, concomitants of despair, such as Europe had hardly known since the Black Death, and there were wholesale manifestations of hysteria which found expression in the insanities of the communistic Anabaptists and seemed to involve even physical nature. In this past year of grace, 1549, huge swarms of caterpillars had devoured the foliage in all parts of northern Europe. There was a heavy mortality of cattle in Germany, and in the northern parts of the country a malignant petechial fever among men, and there were reports of mould spots and bad water. There was an extraordinary aurora borealis on September 21st, and from England early in 1550 came news of stinking mists along the Severn, and on April 15, a new outbreak of the English sweating sickness. The next year there were fogs, floods, tempests and earthquakes in various parts of the continent. As soon as the Diet of Augsburg came to its unsatisfactory close, with both Protestants and Catholics detesting the sickly compromise of Charles interim, Philip mounted his horse and, attended by the same escort in yellow cloaks, began his journey homeward. He went as rapidly as possible, making few formal stops except at Trent, where the council was still in ineffectual session, and the arrival of the emperor's firstborn was an event to be celebrated with fiestas and performances of Ariosto. Weeks and months of travel still remained. It was late in July when he reached Barcelona from Italy. August had come when he rode up the blessed hills into Valladolid. Maximilian was there before him, having posted back from Germany as soon as he had made Philip's defeat certain. He was more a cock of the walk than ever. His pretty wife was pregnant a second time, and they both proudly showed to Philip the tiny girl born to them at Cigales on All Saints' Day of the previous year. As the prince bent over the cradle of his niece, or held her in his arms, he may have wondered, as people often do, what life held in prospect for this mite of royalty. No doubt Providence kept from him the slightest intimation that on growing to womanhood she would share his matrimonial bed, bear him children, and die with his name on her lips. It was good to be home. The farms were teeming, the fairs were crowded with men and with goods. The peasants sang at their work. Hidalgos in bright vesture rode about on business or pleasure. Life moved easily. The sun shone and the birds sang. The silver bells pealed over the sandy hillsides. Even a woman could ride the roads in safety. No man killed another for the cause of religion. It was Holy Spain he came back to, and Holy Spain was happy and at peace. Who could ask for more than to rule such a country? Yet Philip hoped to be emperor.